This is an open letter to Sean Stiegemeier of Iceland. Mr. Stiegemeier, I don't know if you were involved in the recent Draw Muhammad Day protest, or if you're even aware of the protest and the purpose behind it, so allow me to explain. On November 2nd, 2004, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was ruthlessly murdered while bicycling to work. His killer, a Dutch-Moroccan man, cited Theo's work as the reason for the slaying. You see, Van Gogh had been openly critical of Islam in his films. He was murdered for speaking ill of the religion. Now, we should have spoken out then. In fact, some of us did, but the message was never really conveyed, whether by the people, by our governments, or by the media. On September 30th, 2005, a group of 12 cartoonists working for the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten attempted to revisit the issue by posting 12 individual political cartoons depicting Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. Now, as you may well be aware, their efforts were not responded to positively. In fact, outraged Muslims took to the streets by the thousands, burning effigies and flags, firebombing embassies, and screaming for the death of the cartoonists. Over 100 people died in these riots. Death threats were issued, and bounties were placed on the heads of those cartoonists who dared depict the Prophet Muhammad. Our Western media lay eerily silent through this, reporting on the violence that occurred, but never taking the issue head-on. One must assume that they neglected to properly cover the situation for fear of being pulled into the violence themselves. We should have spoken out then. Some tried, but so few voices are rarely heard. 5 years later, on January 2nd, 2010, one of the Danish cartoonists, Kurt Vestergaard, was attacked in his home in front of his grandchild. Luckily, he was able to flee to his panic room, which had been installed because of the previous threats to his life. We should have spoken out then. Strangely, there was barely a whisper. It took a thinly veiled death threat to the creators of South Park, possibly one of the most beloved cartoon shows of all time, to shake us to our senses. A cultural icon, a shining example of irreverent speech at its worst, or its finest, depending on your point of view. Comedy Central quickly moved to censor its own show, a show that had built its very foundation on rudeness, insensitivity, and crass jokes. Perhaps there were more appropriate times to speak out, but this is when it happened. Tens of thousands of free citizens from around the globe banded together. If our media wasn't going to stand up, if our governments weren't going to stand up, we sure as hell were. A message had to be sent, loud, clear, and unwavering. Free speech will not be intimidated or silenced by threats or even acts of violence. So why do I write this letter to you? What do you have to do with any of this? Actually, you play a very important role in the events of May the 20th, or at least your art does. One of the goals of Draw Muhammad Day was to elicit a response from Muslims, a response that had been woefully absent during the other events, at least in the Western media. We wanted to see an appropriate response. We were hoping, practically begging, for a tempered reaction from Muslims, one that didn't include death threats or violence. There are only a handful of days that I will remember for the rest of my life. One of those is January 28th, 1986, when I watched with my 5th grade class as the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded during takeoff. Another is September 11th, 2001, when the entire world seemed to stand still as the Twin Towers fell. Another of those days is May 20th, 2010. A day that over 40,000 free citizens of the world stood up to exercise their right to offend. Some drew stick figures, others were more in-depth, some bordered on the obscene, and some even crossed that border. All that was needed now to complete that day was a response from the offended. Would it be bombs? Would it be death threats? Would it be violence? No. On that day, something happened that I wouldn't believe unless I'd seen it. Over 60,000 Muslims came together, aligned face to face against those who would insult their prophet, and they did their best to show us why they love Muhammad as they do. Their response brought tears to my eyes, not because I agree with them. I am an atheist. I don't agree with them. But because they stood up to the challenge, and they did so with such honor, elegance, and dignity as should make any man weep. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. A video representing the voices of 60,000 devout Muslims who hold nothing but reverence, love, and compassion for Muhammad in their hearts. They attempted to explain why they revere this man so highly, the person they hold most dear in all of the world, in all of existence, someone they honor second only to their God, and they choose your art as a backdrop for that message. And I can understand why they chose your art. Every image brings forth the majesty of the earth. Every shot commands emotion to stir. Every frame is nothing short of perfection. This is how they feel about their prophet. Just contemplate that for a moment. 60,000 Muslims faced with the contemplation of over 40,000 insulting images of the person they hold most dear, and they choose your images as the background to deliver their peaceful and elegant response. As an artist, I could think of no higher compliment. Now I know that you have a right to your work. I respect your rights. And I acknowledge that you have no legal reason to allow their video to be shown, with your work included. I implore you, however, don't silence their reasoned and appropriate response. We've come so far, and we've paid such a high price for it. Please remove the DMCA claims on the Muslim response to Muhammad Day videos. Please allow them to use your work for such a noble cause. All of them. Thank you for your time. Patrick Farabee.